This is assignment number 4, and this is by Emily Bain and Kylie Pilker. This is an overview of what I will be talking about. I will be talking about the movie Amistad and Beloved, and then Kylie later on in the presentation will be talking about 12 Years a Slave and Birth of a Nation. But I will be talking about the depictions of slavery, the effects between 1980 and 2000, the changing ideas, and the terms the movie presents slavery in, and how the film shows slaves adapting to freedom. Depiction of slavery. The movie Beloved shows how slaves are adjusting to the lives after slavery, and Beloved is a good movie to show how throughout the movie how Seth tries to live her life after slavery, and the movie constantly shows flashbacks of that. And one big example that I'm sure you guys remember is how Seth attempted to kill her children so they wouldn't get put into slavery. The white slave owner showed up to their house, and Seth saw this and ran her children to the shed, and she killed one of her children and attempted to kill the rest, but she didn't. But she would rather see her children dead than to experience slavery like she did, because she had such bad experiences. She did not want her children to go through the same thing that she did, understandably. And then with Amistad shows how badly African Americans were treated even if they weren't slaves. And for example, the Cubans, they were on their island, and a slave catcher came and just took them just because they were African American. It didn't matter to him if they were slaves or not. And it just makes me really sad, because they were so used to their ways in their home, and they couldn't even communicate with Americans to tell them that they weren't slaves because of the language barrier that existed between the two. Effects of slavery between 1980 and 2000. In both of the movies, I really liked how they were finally addressing slavery and showing what it was actually like, and they weren't sugarcoating it or making a false story like some of the previous movies we have watched. And a big example that I had from Amistad was how the Cubans were treated on the boat. Once again, they were torn from their homes, and they weren't even slaves, and they were put on the boat just because they were African Americans, and they were forced to work. They were treated horribly. They were whipped. They were yelled at, and all of that other stuff, just because they were African American and they wanted to use them in their slave trade, and they were made false papers. And this really shows that this really happened. This isn't just a story that Hollywood made up. This is what actually happened, and they want their viewers to know that this is something that actually happened in history, and we as Americans, we are supposed to learn from history and learn from our mistakes, and this is something that we can learn from our mistakes from. And then in Beloved, Seth continuously has flashbacks of her slave days throughout the movie, and we can see that there are flashbacks throughout the movie, and even the spirit that haunts her house is supposed to be her daughter that died whenever she killed her in the shed. Like that, she can't live like a normal life because of everything that happened during her slave days. Changing ideas. Both movies represent the changing ideas and values in relation to slavery and effects to slavery. In Amistad, the lawyer represents the Cubans, even though a lot of people don't want him to. So in the beginning of the movie, when he was considering representing them, a lot of experienced lawyers told him, "Don't do it. You're just starting out, so you shouldn't take on this case, because maybe this is all that you will be known for, and since you're going against the grain, a lot of people will not like you to represent them in the future, because they'll just know you for this one case." And through the movie, you can see that he was receiving death threats, and he was also getting letters sent to him saying how bad he was for representing these people. And then even going into court, you can see all the people yelling at the lawyer because he was representing these people when a lot of people didn't want him to. And then in Beloved, Seth is working at a bakery. She has worked there for 16 years, and she is providing the best life she can for her children. She goes there every day and works hard. She comes home and she works for her children. She tries to make sure her children live the best life that they can, because she's experienced slavery. She knows she knows what it's like to work for nothing and receive nothing in return. So she wants her children to live the best lives that they can through her working at a bakery. Terms the movie presents slavery in. In Amistad, it presents slavery as an abusive institution. And an example that I wanted to talk about was the people that were thrown off the boat because of food shortage. So when they found out they were running out of food, they just decided to weed out the weak essentially, and they stripped them of their clothes, they shackled them and made them go in a line, and they threw at the end of the line they put on a weight and threw the weight into the water, and then you just watched all the slaves lose their balance, fall, and just glide off the boat and into the water and fall into the water. And you watch them go down into the water as well. And I feel like that really showed like how much they didn't care about slaves as humans. They didn't even think of them as humans. They were just somebody who worked for them, and that's it. This this scene was very like surreal for me. Like I knew slavery was bad. I knew how bad it was, but like this movie really pulled at my heartstrings because I just watched all of these innocent people just die because they ran out of food or they were going to run out of food. And then in Beloved, they introduced slavery as an institution that suppressed slaves socially and economically. And economically, Seth worked at her bakery for about 16 years, and they were celebrating something, and she said that she's like, I haven't been late one day in 16 years. He won't fire me for being late one day. So she showed up late one day out of the 16 years that she worked there. And the white owner said, "You're fired. You were late." And then he started listing off all these reasons that she was fired too. And then she just walked off. And then socially, Seth is continuously haunted by her past. So she didn't have a lot of friends because of she didn't have a lot of friends, and a lot of people didn't like her because they knew she killed her, that she attempted to kill her children and killed one child. And that haunts her socially because she doesn't have a lot of friends. And like through the movie, you can just see flashbacks of her thinking about her slavery, and that impacts how she raises her children as well. How the film shows slaves adapting to freedom. With Amistad, it kind of has an almost like happier ending because after the Cubans on the Amistad were declared free, the court staffed a ship to bring them back to their homeland, and you can see the main character just staring at the horizon and looking at the sun and just showing like how happy he is to be going back to their home, because that's all they wanted. They didn't want any money or anything. They just wanted to go back to their home and live the life that they used to live. And then in Beloved, it's kind of more of a sad situation because it shows how much slavery affected their lives, and like every character that had a huge role in the movie, they talked about how slavery impacted their lives for the worse. Like with Seth, it affects her socially, emotionally, physically. And then her boyfriend, even, he talks about how he kind of lost everything, and he also talks about the scars on his back and how he was whipped and all of that stuff.
Hello, my name is Kylie Pelker, and I will be taking the second half. What I will be talking about today is 12 Years a Slave and Birth of a Nation. I will cover the points of the depiction of the slavery, the effects between the 1980s and 2000, the changing of ideas, the terms the movie presents in slavery, and how the film shows slaves adapting to their freedom. Okay, so the depiction of slavery. 12 Years a Slave was basically about slavery, how it was really strong in the South, and they didn't really care if you were a free slave or not. So therefore, an example of this would be whenever Platt was kidnapped and he was taken to the South. You know, Platt really had no idea. He was basically tricked into going to play his instrument down south with these guys, and he was going to do it for money because his family needed money. So with that, I felt like since Platt needed money still, that he needed money to help his wife, because maybe they weren't getting enough money in the North as it is anyway, considering that they are black. But so he went down to get money, to make more money, down the south, and these guys tricked him into going, which he ended up, he was kidnapped, and they, got him intoxicated, and he ended up, not knowing where he was and was being kidnapped into a slave, and he didn't have his papers to be free, so he ended up, being a slave for 12 years, of course. So basically the depiction here was just, slavery was a lot stronger in the South than it was in the North, because Platt could not get back to the North, without his papers. And also, Birth of a Nation, they made the slaves feel more important in this film, which I thought was very, a little different than the other films. They were really just like the slaves were just like every other slave. And Nat, spoke highly of his slave owner. His slave owner treated him well, and considering things turned around once Nat started talking back to his master. I think Nat kind of got a little bit comfortable with his master, and kind of like told his master, to get his wife that whenever they were auctioning her off, so kind of like they grew a pretty big relationship together, but things kind of turned around once Nat started, speaking out a little bit more and finding his kind of overstepping his boundaries a little bit, in which his slave owner obviously didn't like that as much. So the effects of slavery between 1980 and the 2000s. So 12 years a slave, there were rules in place, but the South really didn't follow these rules. So it didn't really matter about the slavery rules or anything like that in the South as much as it did in the North. So for example here, Platt's boss came to rescue him, and he did have his papers. So, Platt was able to, his master had a white man as a worker, and, he was able to deliver that letter for him, because, Platt was obviously able to read and write, and he had asked this guy to go ahead and send a letter, and, the white man did it for Platt, the white man did feel sorry for them. So, Platt's boss came to rescue him, and, his master was not, was going to take them to court. Like, he's like, even though Platt was free, Platt's master was going to take him to court, because Platt was money for him, Platt was working in the fields, his master paid money for Platt, and so his master was willing to take him to court for, taking Platt away from him. In Birth of a Nation, they gave them the illusion of freedom. So for example of this, they were free, like they were a little bit more free than the other slaves. They were free to like speak their mind around their master, they kind of went anywhere around the plantation and stuff. But whenever they left the plantation, like for example, his wife, whenever Nat's wife left the plantation and she went to go get water, she was too far off the plantation without a note or a letter saying where she was. So, she was beaten really badly for this. So, they were free, but then at times, they, if they got too far off the plantation, or, whenever Nat talked back to his master, he was beaten, so the changing ideas. So for 12 years a slave, not all black people were born slaves. So for an example, Platt, when Platt returns, his kids and his daughter's husband and their child, like they were never slaves. They never have been. They never experienced this because they were in the North, which they were free in the North, and they should have been free in the South as well. But with the rules and the South not obeying the rules, that's just kind of how it went. So for Birth of a Nation, the slaves were not supposed to know how to read or write. That was kind of known. And I do believe, the masters were a little nervous if, and worried that, the slaves were going to, uprise, or, if they knew how to read or write. Slaves were just considered, the livestock. So, but for an example of this, the slave owner's wife taught Nat how to read and write whenever he was little. Whenever at the beginning, Nat's mom was like, I don't want you to learn how to read or write, because she was worried he would be in danger if he knew how to do this. But the slave owner's wife was like, no, like he will be fine. He's perfect. Like he will not get in trouble for this. I just want to teach him how to read or write. So she was a little, genuine towards the slaves, which is a little bit different. But she taught Nat how to read and write, and that's how he was, being able to preach the Bible to everyone around the plantation and the other slaves. So terms the movie presents slavery in. So 12 Years a Slave was an abusive institution. Platt asked a white man to send a letter to his wife, and the white man ended up telling the slave owner. Platt agreed with this white man that, he was willing to send him a letter, if Platt would give him something in return, and Platt gave him money because Platt knew he couldn't use the money anyway. So, and Platt was about to be beat for this since the white man told, but Platt ended up pulling it off to where he didn't get beat. But there was very many scenarios in this movie where Platt was beaten due to the slave owner being so abusive towards him and the others. For an example, the girl that the slave owner abused and sexually abused, he was very abusive towards her. Even if she went and got that soap, she was whipped for just going to get some soap. And for example, for Birth of a Nation, they were relatively happy in this film. For an example, Nat preached to other plantations, and he got to witness firsthand how these other slaves were treated, and he realized that him and his other slave friends, in the same plantation, they didn't have it as bad as some other slave plantations did. They had more freedom with their master.